It is a presidential election year, and this summer has featured the drama of the major party candidates choosing their running mates. But the office of vice president is very different today following the 1967 passage of the 25th Amendment. Prior to that, the office was considered to be so insignificant that fully 18 U.S. presidents have served at least part of their term without a vice president. And in fact, since the office was created in 1789, the United States has gone a cumulative 38 years without a sitting vice president. And yet the odd history of the office that John Adams, the first man to hold the office, described as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived, deserves to be remembered. The U.S. Constitution does little to define the office of the vice presidency. Article 2 defines the executive branch and specifies that a vice president shall be chosen for the same term as the president. The article does, in Clause 6, give a process for succession. In the case of the removal of the president from office, or his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. That brief clause actually raises several questions that the Republic would eventually have to face. But, oddly, while Article 2 defines qualifications for the office of president, namely that the person be a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution, have attained the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States, there was no concurrent definition of the qualifications for vice president. It was originally possible for a vice president to be chosen who did not meet the qualifications to be president. As to duties of the office of vice president, the Constitution doesn't say much. The sole mention is in Article 1, Section 3. The vice president of the United States shall be president of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. There is no clear definition of what a president of the Senate means, and having no vote except in a tie is a severe limit. Since the Senate convened for the first time on March 4, 1789, the vice president has been called upon to break a tie on the floor vote just 301 times out of hundreds of thousands of votes. 12, nearly a quarter of the people who have held the position were never called upon to break a single tie in the United States Senate. And that is it. That is the constitutional role of the vice president. To underline the point, the nation's first vice president, John Adams, elected in 1789, when notified of the results, lamented his choice, writing in a letter to a friend that his time at home prior to the election was the sweetest morsel of my life. I despair of ever tasting such again. His level of enthusiasm for the job was shown in a brief address that he made upon being introduced to the Senate for the first time. Unaccustomed to refuse any public service, however dangerous to my reputation or disproportionate to my talents, it would have been inconsistent to adopt another maxim at this time. A notably irascible man, his role as the president of the Senate was not always appreciated. The nickname given to him by the body was his rotundity. His dissatisfaction with his position showed in a letter to his son, future President John Quincy Adams, in 1789, that the job was not quite adapted to my character, too inactive and mechanical, and more directly in 1790, this confinement will injure my health. In 1793, as the nation grappled with its response to the French Revolution, he made his famous assessment of the office in a letter to his wife, Abigail. But my country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived, or his imagination conceived. And as I can do neither good nor evil, I must be borne away by others, and meet the common fate. And that was the assessment of one of the nation's most active early vice presidents. He was called upon to break a tie in the Senate 29 times, the third most in U.S. history. And of course, Adams did use his position as a springboard to the highest office in the land. His election in 1796 demonstrated the original conception of the vice presidency. Initially, each state would appoint electors representing the numbers of members of the House and Senate that the state had representing them. Then the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom one at least shall not be inhabitant of the same state with themselves. Congress would then count those votes, and the person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president. After the choice of the president, the person having the greatest number of votes of the electors shall be the vice president. That is, the president and vice president were not expected to run on a ticket. Rather, the person with the most electoral votes would be the president, and the person with the second most would be vice president, even if the men were rivals, which in the case of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, they were. During Washington's term, the two men, Jefferson had been Secretary of State, had become rivals, sometimes bitterly, over issues of federal authority. The two had clearly run against each other in 1796, and the race had been close, Adams receiving 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68. While Adams had been, like Washington, a Federalist, and the two generally agreed upon policy, President Adams' vice president was clearly not his supporter. Jefferson was much less active in the role than Adams had been, and only 3 times was asked to cast the deciding vote in the Senate. He described the office in 1797 as honorable and easy. In fact, Jefferson was rarely in the new capital and spent much of the time at his home, but he used the free time offered by his honorable and easy office to oppose Adams politically on a number of fronts, something that contributed to Adams' defeat in the election of 1800, and the first real crisis of the vice presidency. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans had beaten Adams and the Federalists in the Electoral College 73 to 65. But there was a problem, as the website of the Library of Congress explains. However, because electors could not distinguish between president and vice president when voting prior to the 12th Amendment, Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, received the same number of votes in the Electoral College. Thus, under Article II, the tie went before the U.S. House of Representatives, at the time largely consisting of lame duck Federalists, bitter over the election. Despite the apparent fact that Jefferson was supposed to lead the ticket, the House was split, as many Federalists voted for Burr. It took 36 ballots before Jefferson was finally chosen to the office of the president, that he described in the same letter in which he called the office of the vice presidency honorable and easy as but a splendid misery. The contest created its own bit of drama. There was disagreement over whether Burr, often seen as a political opportunist, had campaigned behind Jefferson's back to steal the election in the House. Delaware Representative James Bayard wrote to fellow Federalist Alexander Hamilton, "It is distinctly stated that he is willing to consider the Federalists as his friends and to accept the office of president as their gift. I take it for granted that Mr. B would not only gladly accept the office, but will neglect no means in his power to secure it." Jefferson never seemed to have trusted Burr, so much so that he dropped Burr from the ticket for the election of 1804. Burr thus decided instead to run for the governor of New York, and it was in a dispute over that election that in July of 1804, while still vice president of the United States, Aaron Burr famously killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, leading to the odd situation of the vice president of the United States being charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey. Burr, the subject of other episodes of The History Guy, would later be involved in schemes that would draw a charge of treason, quite a record for the nation's third vice president. A consequence of the contested result of the 1800 election was the first significant redefinition of the office of vice president, the U.S. 12th Amendment, ratified in June of 1804. The most substantive change to the system defined in Article II, Section 1 was that the electors would now name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots the person voted for as vice president. In addition, the amendment specified no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. Now the vice president would be elected separately from the president, and presumably, though not required, as the same electors voted for both, the vice president would be an ally running alongside the presidential contender. But the office was still almost comically irrelevant. Former Massachusetts Governor Eldridge Gerry, for whom the derisive term gerrymandering is named, purportedly sought the office under James Madison in 1812 because he had lost re-election and, being broke, needed a federal job. He died of a heart attack 2 years into his term and was not replaced. The next vice president was Daniel Tompkins, elected with James Monroe in 1816. Journalist Tony Horwitz wrote in Smithsonian Magazine in 2017 that Tompkins was a drunken embezzler, described as a degraded sot, who paid so little heed to his duties that Congress docked his salary. The office was the butt of many jokes and poorly regarded. When offered the position on the 1840 Whig ticket with William Henry Harrison, statesman Daniel Webster refused, saying, "I do not propose to be buried until I am dead." That same year, incumbent Martin Van Buren didn't even choose a vice presidential running mate. The decision was a political compromise. Kentuckian Richard Minter Johnson, who had earned fame for killing the Native American leader Tecumseh in a battle, had been Van Buren's vice president in his first term. And eccentric, Johnson had once introduced a bill to send an expedition to drill the polar regions and determine if the earth was hollow and habitable. As vice president, Johnson rankled conservatives in Washington, D.C. by taking a black enslaved woman as his common-law wife. And after the financial panic of 1837, Horwitz wrote, Johnson succumbed to chronic debts and decamped for Kentucky, where he ran a hotel and tavern and grew so disheveled that an English visitor wrote, if he should become president, he will be as strange-looking a potentate as ever ruled. Realizing that Johnson was, quote, dead weight, Van Buren simply ran alone. Harrison was elected, along with former Virginia Senator John Tyler, and that would create another crisis for the office. In 1841, Harrison died, just 31 days into his term. John Tyler became the first vice president to test the succession clause of Article 2, but there was an issue. The clause does not actually say that the vice president becomes president upon the death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office. Rather, Article 2 merely states that the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. That is, was the vice president merely a caretaker, acting until Congress chose a successor, or did the vice president become president in their own right? Tyler argued that the office had devolved to him and finished Harrison's term, but what became known as the Tyler precedent was not universally agreed upon, and notably not codified in law until the ratification of the 25th Amendment in 1967. Prior to that amendment, 7 U.S. presidents, Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Chester A. Arthur, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry S. Truman, and Lyndon B. Johnson, who succeeded presidents who died in office, might actually have been only acting presidents, although Roosevelt, Coolidge, Truman, and Johnson all subsequently won election to the presidency. George M. Dallas, vice president from 1845 to 1849 under James K. Polk, found the demands of his office so light that he maintained his law practice throughout. He complained that the office forms no part of the government. He enters into no administrative sphere. He has practically no legislative, executive, or judicial functions. He doesn't debate or vote. Where is he to go? What is he to do? Nowhere. Nothing. The office was so irrelevant that when Vice President William R.D. King died of tuberculosis in April of 1853, just 25 days after being sworn in, he wasn't replaced during the term of President Franklin Pierce. Horwitz noted that President Pierce gave a speech addressing other matters before concluding with a brief allusion to the vice president's death. When the office was finally filled again, it was with the election of President James Buchanan and running mate, Kentuckian John Breckinridge, the youngest man ever to hold the office. He was elected a U.S. Senator after leaving office in 1861, but at the outset of the Civil War, he advocated for Kentucky's secession. When the move failed, he resigned his Senate seat and signed up with the Confederate Army. As Kentucky had not seceded, the state considered the act to be treason, and after Aaron Burr became the second former vice president to be officially charged as a traitor. He was a major general and briefly Secretary of War under the Confederacy, but as the cause collapsed, he couldn't return home because of his outstanding charge. He escaped the Confederacy in a rowboat and eventually made it to Canada, where his family had fled. President Andrew Johnson offered him amnesty in 1868 and a return to the United States, but the state charge of treason wasn't officially dropped until a century later in 1968. Meanwhile, his replacement as vice president under Abraham Lincoln, Hannibal Hamlin, spent most of the war at his home in Maine. He complained to his wife that he was the most unimportant man in Washington, ignored by the president, the cabinet, and Congress. He was replaced on the ticket in 1864 by Andrew Johnson, whom Horwitz notes was described as shamefully drunk at his inauguration. When Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, Johnson became president, or maybe acting president if you prefer, and the office of vice president wasn't replaced. Ulysses Grant was elected in 1868, and his vice president, Schuyler Colfax, became embroiled in a railroad bribery scandal. The House moved to impeach him, but the vote failed because there was only a few weeks remaining in his term. Grant replaced him with Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson for the election of 1872, despite the fact that Wilson was also implicated in the same bribery scandal. Wilson died of a stroke in 1875, and the office went unfilled for 2 years. The office continued irrelevancy through the 19th century. Grover Cleveland's vice president from 1893 to 1897 was Adlai Stevenson I. Horwitz writes that in 1897 he was asked if President Cleveland had consulted him about anything of even minor consequence. "Not yet," he said, "but there's still a few weeks of my term remaining." When Theodore Roosevelt was offered a place on the Republican ticket in 1900, he worried that the office was not a stepping stone to anything except oblivion. He was incorrect. He ascended to the presidency, or acting presidency if you prefer, after William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Again, the office of vice president was not replaced, creating a potential crisis when Roosevelt narrowly escaped death in a streetcar accident in 1902. When he was elected in his own right in 1904, he was said to dislike his vice president, Indiana Senator Charles Fairbanks, and ignored him. When Fairbanks was offered a place again on the Republican ticket in 1916, he refused, saying, "My name must not be considered for vice president. Please withdraw it." William Howard Taft's vice president, James S. Sherman, died a week before the 1912 election. Taft did nothing to replace him and simply ran with a dead man. Thomas Marshall, vice president for 8 years under Woodrow Wilson, was completely left out of the loop when the president was incapacitated by a stroke in 1919. Found the office so dreary that he only attended one cabinet meeting. When Calvin Coolidge was elected vice president under Warren Harding in 1920, Marshall sent him a note that read, "Please accept my sincere sympathies." Coolidge himself wasn't exactly thrilled with the prospect. When his wife asked him if he would accept the nomination, he told her, "I suppose I'll have to." When Harding died in 1929, Coolidge became president, or acting president if you prefer, and again, no one was chosen to replace him as vice president. When Coolidge ran for president in 1924, he had difficulty even finding someone who would accept the position as vice presidential nominee. Ohio Governor Frank Loudon and Idaho Senator William Borah both were nominated and both refused. His eventual choice, Charles G. Dawes, had received the Nobel Peace Prize for a plan to rebuild Europe after the First World War. Only, Horowitz opines, to wither as VP to do-nothing Calvin Coolidge. Charles Curtis, elected on the ticket with Herbert Hoover in 1928, was a member of the Kaw Nation, the first Native American and non-European to achieve such a high office. Like Hoover, his political career ended when the administration failed to manage the Great Depression. An offhand comment by Curtis in 1930, but wrongly attributed to Hoover, that good times are just around the corner, was a politically ruinous boomerang. Franklin Roosevelt had 3 vice presidents. The first, former Speaker of the House John Nance Garner, made perhaps the most astute description of the vice presidency, saying that the office was not worth a warm bucket of piss, although the press later softened the phrase to warm bucket of spit. Former Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace replaced Garner on the ticket in 1940, who was then dumped by the party for being too liberal and replaced with Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman in 1944. But Truman only served for 82 days before Roosevelt's death in 1945, getting him scant experience before inheriting the office during a very dangerous period in world affairs. This highlighted the issue of a process to replace the vice president, as Truman, who was only an acting president, if you prefer, was without a vice president for nearly 4 years of international peril. For most of U.S. history, the office of vice president was just not considered to be all that important. But according to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library's website, it was the Cold War, when political, military, and social tensions constantly veered on the edge, that Congress began to worry about what would happen if the president was incapacitated or even died, something that became all that more important when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. In 1965, Congress passed the 25th Amendment, which was sent to the states and ratified in 1967. For the first time, the amendment clarified that if the office of president becomes vacant, then the vice president assumes the office. And also for the first time, the amendment created a process by which if the office of vice president becomes vacant, then a new person could be appointed. There's a lot that can be said about the modern vice presidents since 1967, but the office is generally considered to have more responsibility today, to be relatively more important. Still, Congress did not even provide the vice president with an official residence in Washington, D.C. until 1974. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.